You've finally done it. You've finally taken the most epic sunset photo of your life, and now you need to edit it. When it comes to sunset photos, it's all about getting the colors right. You want them to look epic, but you also don't want them to be too bright, too dark, or too oversaturated. So we're gonna edit this photo that I took over Lake Ontario to be a very blue and orange sunset, which we've already got those colors in our photo. And depending on the type of sunset you're shooting, sometimes it's a little bit more pink, sometimes it's a little bit more orange, sometimes you can even get a little bit of green. Also, if you stick around to the end, I'm gonna be sharing the exact settings that I use to edit this photo and make them available for you to download. But now let's jump into this edit. The first thing I wanna do is make sure that my exposure and my whites and my blacks are set correctly. In order to do that, I'm actually gonna hold Alt on the keyboard, and you can see as I drag these sliders for both the shadows and the highlights that it shows where the image is being clipped. So I don't want too much of the image to show up, but just a little bit so that I know I'm really squeezing everything I can out of this photo. Then I'm gonna jump down to the presence tab, and one of the things that I really wanna make sure of is that this photo doesn't look too harsh. And the way I like to treat this is by going under the clarity and actually dropping the clarity. And what that lets me do is to kind of give the photo this soft look. And I'm gonna do another thing later on with the clarity, but for now, I'm just gonna drag that down. Once I'm happy with that, I'm gonna jump down to vibrance and saturation. And you can see as I'm sliding it, it's kind of like the lazy man's way of just adding more color to this photo. It's not quite the best way, but because raw files tend to be a little bit desaturated right out of camera, I do wanna add a little bit of vibrance and a little bit of saturation. Then I'm gonna jump up to the white balance. And the key with white balance is setting it so that the colors look accurate to the way you remember the photo being taken. In my case, I don't wanna go too far to the left because that'll end up looking too blue. And I don't wanna go too far to the right because then everything will look orange and it will just eliminate the blue that was in the clouds. In this case, I'm gonna stick to 5600, which will allow me to keep both the blues and the oranges that are in this photo. Next, I like to jump down to tone curve. And tone curve can be a bit complicated, but the first thing I wanna do is now expand back out the contrast that is in this image. I'm gonna apply a very light S curve and then jump right into my red, green, and blue curves. Now, you can really play around with this, and the way to understand how the tone curve works is that the left lower portion of the tone curve represents the color that is in the shadow, whereas the right portion of the tone curve represents the color that is in the highlights. I can do the same thing for the green channel. Let's say I want a bit more magenta, I can pull that down or create more green in the highlights, which is probably not what I want to go for. So I'm actually going to jump right into the blue curve, which allows me to control blue and yellow, which are the two colors that I really want to focus on for this edit. I'm going to pull a little bit more blue out of the midtones and then drag down the highlights because all the blank areas of the sky, like over here, are more in the white and the highlight range. So if I drag that down, I can really make my sky start to look yellow. Same thing for the shadows. I don't want my shadows to be too blue and too depressing, so I'm actually gonna play with them a little bit so I can get a little bit more color and maybe a little bit more yellow out of my shadows. Now down to the HSL, and this is where you can really start to be creative with your edit. Now, I don't wanna go too crazy because I'm already pretty happy with the way this photo works, so I'm gonna increase the luminance or the brightness of the yellow tones so that the sky, the blank areas of the sky start to look a little bit brighter. Then under hue, I'm gonna remove or kind of like hue shift some of the colors that I don't want to see. I don't really want purple, so I'm gonna take my purples and move them towards blue. I'm gonna take my magentas and move them towards red. And I'm also gonna take my yellows and my reds and move them towards orange, which will give me this really cool split tone effect where I have a lot of blue, a lot of cool tone, and a lot of orange. And you can see that here where the sky starts to look a little bit smoother because of those adjustments. Then under saturation, I am finding that the blue is probably a little bit too blue for my liking, and I'm gonna desaturate it just a little bit. Not too much, but just enough so that we can start to make the orange stand out a little bit more in this photo. Saturation really is up to personal taste, but in this case, because we're doing a blue and orange edit, those are the two colors that that I'm really gonna focus on. Now, if you wanna get really wild, you can go down to color calibration. If you're finding that the colors in your photo just aren't looking the way that you want, this is kind of one way to make big, broad, overall hue and saturation adjustments. In my case, I do want a little bit more cyan because I find it just sells the mood a little bit, and maybe I'm gonna shift those oranges a little bit more towards red. Again, it's very subtle, but it's just one of those tools you can have in your back pocket if after you've made your hue and saturation adjustments, you want to pull a little bit more out of your photo. Now I'm going to jump down to color grading, and you can think of color grading as the finishing touches that you want to apply to your photo. In this case, I'm going to apply a color grading method that I've used quite a lot on some of my recent photos, and that's to take the shadows and make them blue, and take the midtones and make them orange. I'm also going to darken the shadows so that we're creating more contrast, where the shadows and the blacks look a little bit more darker. I'm also gonna take my highlights and make them just a tinge red, but also drop the luminance. So that way we can actually add color to where it would be white. So instead of having a white blown out sunset, we actually have a sunset that has these peaks of orange and red. Now, to really sell this edit, I think we need to do some masking. And masking is kind of the modern day equivalent of dodging and burning. And that's where you brighten certain areas of your image and darken others. One effect, because I was talking about making this image look nice and smooth, I'm actually gonna grab a brush and do a negative clarity setting. And then I'm gonna brush around some of these areas where the water is kind of meeting the sand so that we get this kind of like glowing, smooth effect. And you can see the before and the after, and it's very subtle, but it allows us to sell the fact that this is kind of like a smooth, glowing sunset. Then I'm gonna apply a radial gradient from where the sun is coming from. I'm gonna boost the exposure. That will allow the sun to look just a little bit brighter, because remember, we darkened it under color grading, so now I'm gonna brighten it back up, but I'm also gonna do a negative dehaze. And dehaze kind of smooths out those really contrasted areas of your photo. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's creating this kind of bloom effect so that it looks like the light is a little bit brighter than it actually is. How you use masking is really up to you. In my case, I like to use it to de-emphasize certain areas of my image, but you could also do the opposite and boost the exposure or boost things like clarity if you want more contrast out of certain areas of your image or less contrast in other areas of your image. I want to clean up this photo. It looks great and the foreground looks great with all these rocks, but there are some kind of like big stick weed things that just don't look that great. I'm gonna grab the clone stamp tool or the healing brush tool and actually start to brush out some of these little pieces of rocks and whatever they are, the garbage, so that we're not having a distracting foreground. My goal here, again, is to have people focus on the sunset, on the horizon, on the subject that's in my photo, and not get distracted by all these little pieces in the foreground. Keep in mind the settings that I'm using on this photo might not work on your photo, but if you want to give them a try, there is a preset available for download in the description below, so go ahead and check that out. Or if you want to see more videos just like this, I recommend checking out this Lightroom editing tutorial so you can jump in and start editing more photos right away. And until the next one, peace.